Hi there, my name is Oliver. Tonight I will be reading Chapter 1 of The Star's My Destination by Alfred Bester. This is one of my favorite science fiction stories, and I wanted to share it with you. Before I begin, I want to talk a little bit about how I came to hear this story for the first time. If you want to get right into things, please feel free to skip my rambling. Years ago, before she passed, my mother read me this story as part of something of a tradition we had. She told me that the book it was printed in, one of a set of volumes called A Treasury of Great Science Fiction, was one she had had in her collection several times over her life. As she put it, she would forget about just how wonderful the stories contained inside were and pass the book on or donate it to a library, only to regret it a year or two later and be unable to find another copy. Finally, after doing this 2 or 3 times, she resolved to curb this impulse. The result is the copy I now hold in my hands, which I inherited from her after she passed on. For this reason, as well as the sheer quality of the story, these books are very special to me. Thankfully, I don't have the same impulse and fully intend to pass them on someday the way she passed them on to me. Anyway, enough of that. Here's the story. The Star's My Destination by Alfred Bester. Part 1. Tiger, tiger, burning bright, in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? Blake. Prologue. This was a golden age, a time of high adventure, rich living, and hard dying. But nobody thought so. This was a future of fortune and theft, pillage and rapine, culture and vice. But nobody admitted it. This was an age of extremes, a fascinating century of freaks. But nobody loved it. All the habitable worlds of the solar system were occupied. 3 planets and 8 satellites and 11 million people swarmed in one of the most exciting ages ever known. Yet minds still yearned for other times, as always. The solar system seethed with activity, fighting, feeding, and breeding, learning the new technologies that spewed forth almost before the old had been mastered, girding itself for the first exploration of the far stars in deep space, but where are the new frontiers, the Romantics cried, unaware that the frontier of the mind had opened in a laboratory on Callisto at the turn of the 24th century. A researcher named Jaunt set fire to his bench and himself, accidentally, and let out a yell for help with particular reference to a fire extinguisher. Who so surprised as Jaunt and his colleagues when he found himself standing alongside said extinguisher, 70 feet removed from his lab bench? They put Jaunt out and went into the whys and wherefores of his instantaneous 70-foot journey. Teleportation, the transportation of oneself through space by an effort of the mind alone, had long been a theoretic concept, and there were a few hundred badly documented proofs that it had happened in the past. This was the first time that it had ever taken place before professional observers. They investigated the Jaunt effect savagely. This was something too earth-shaking to handle with kid gloves, and Jaunt was anxious to make his name immortal. He made his will and said farewell to his friends. Jaunt knew he was going to die because his fellow researchers were determined to kill him if necessary. There was no doubt about that. 12 psychologists, parapsychologists, and neurometrists of varying specialization were called in as observers. The experimenters sealed Jaunt into an unbreakable crystal tank. They opened a water valve, feeding water into the tank, and let Jaunt watch them smash the valve handle. It was impossible to open the tank. It was impossible to stop the flow of water. The theory was that if it had required the threat of death to goad Jaunt into teleporting himself in the first place, they'd damned well threaten him with death again. The tank filled quickly. The observers collected data with the tense precision of an Eclipse camera crew. Jaunt began to drown. Then he was outside the tank, dripping and coughing explosively. He'd teleported again. The experts examined and questioned him. They studied graphs and x-rays, neural patterns, and body chemistry. They began to get an inkling of how Jaunt had teleported. On the technical grapevine, this had to be kept secret after all, they sent out a call for suicide volunteers. They were still in the primitive stage of teleportation. Death was the only spur they knew. They briefed the volunteers thoroughly. Jaunt lectured on what he had done and how he thought he had done it. Then they proceeded to murder the volunteers. They drowned them, hanged them, burned them. They invented new forms of slow and controlled death. There was never any doubt in any of the subjects that death was the object. 80% of the volunteers died, and the agonies and remorse of their murders would make a fascinating and horrible study. But that has no place in this history except to highlight the monstrosity of the times. 80% of the volunteers died, but 20% jaunted. The name became a word almost immediately. Bring back the romantic age, the Romantics pleaded, when men could risk their lives in high adventure. The body of knowledge grew rapidly. By the first decade of the 24th century, the principles of jaunting were established, and the first school was opened by Charles Fort Jaunt himself, then 57, immortalized and ashamed to admit that he had never dared jaunt again. But the primitive days were past. It was no longer necessary to threaten a man with death to make him teleport. They had learned how to teach man to recognize, discipline, and exploit yet another resource of his limitless mind. How exactly did man teleport? One of the most unsatisfactory explanations was provided by Spencer Thompson, publicity representative of the Jaunt schools, in a press interview. Jaunting is like seeing. It is a natural aptitude of almost every human organism, but it can only be developed by training and experience. You mean we couldn't see without practice? The reporter asked. Obviously, you're either unmarried or have no children, preferably both. I don't understand. Anyone who's observed an infant learning to use its eyes would. But what is teleportation? The transportation of oneself from one locality to another by effort of the mind alone. You mean we can think ourselves from, say, New York to Chicago? Precisely, provided one thing is clearly understood. In jaunting from New York to Chicago, it is necessary for the person teleporting himself to know exactly where he is when he starts and where he's going. How's that? If you were in a dark room and unaware of where you were, it would be impossible to jaunt anywhere with safety. And if you knew where you were but intended to jaunt to a place you'd never seen, you would never arrive alive. One cannot jaunt from an unknown departure point to an unknown destination. Both must be known, memorized, and visualized. But if we know where we are and where we're going, we can be pretty sure we'll jaunt and arrive. Would we arrive naked? If you started naked. I mean, would our clothes teleport with us? When people teleport, they also teleport the clothes they wear and whatever they are strong enough to carry. I hate to disappoint you, but even ladies' clothes would arrive with them. But how do we do it? How do we think? With our minds. And how does the mind think? What is the thinking process? Exactly how do we remember, imagine, deduce, and create? Exactly how do the brain cells operate? I don't know. Nobody knows. And nobody knows exactly how we teleport either. But we know we can do it, just as we know that we can think. Have you ever heard of Descartes? He said, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. We say, cogito ergo jaunteo. I think, therefore I jaunt. If it is thought that Thomson's explanation is exasperating, inspect this report of Sir John Kelvin to the Royal Society on the mechanism of jaunting. We have established that the teleportative ability is associated with the Nissl bodies, or tigroid substance, in nerve cells. The tigroid substance is easiest demonstrated by Nissl's method of using 3.75 grams of methylene blue and 1.75 grams of Venetian soap, dissolved in 1,000 cubic centimeters of water. Where the tigroid substance does not appear, jaunting is impossible. Teleportation is a tigroid function. Applause. Any man was capable of jaunting, provided he developed two faculties, visualization and concentration. He had to visualize completely and precisely the point to which he desired to teleport himself, and he had to concentrate the latent energy of his mind into a single thrust to get him there. Above all, he had to have faith, the faith that Charles Fort Jaunt never recovered. He had to believe he would jaunt. The slightest doubt would block the mind thrust necessary for teleportation. The limitations with which every man is born necessarily limited the ability to jaunt. Some could visualize magnificently and set the coordinates of their destination with precision, but lacked the power to get there. Others had the power, but could not, so to speak, see where they were jaunting. And space set a final limitation, for no man had ever jaunted further than 1,000 miles. He could work his way in jaunting jumps over land and water from Nome to Mexico, but no jump could exceed 1,000 miles. By the 2420s, this form of employment application blank had become commonplace. Jaunt class, official rating, check 1 only. M, 1,000 miles, D, 500 miles, C, 100 miles, L, 50 miles, X, 10 miles, V, 5 miles. The old Bureau of Motor Vehicles took over the new job and regularly tested and classed jaunt applicants, and the old American Automobile Association changed its initials to AJA. Despite all efforts, no man had ever jaunted across the voids of space, although many experts and fools had tried. Helmut Grant, for one, who spent a month memorizing the coordinates of a jaunt stage on the moon and visualized every mile of the 240,000-mile trajectory from Times Square to Kepler City. Grant jaunted and disappeared. They never found him. They never found Enzio Dandridge, a Los Angeles revivalist looking for heaven. Jacob Maria Freundlich, a paraphysicist who should have known better than to jaunt into deep space searching for metadimensions. Shipwreck Kogan, a professional seeker after notoriety, and hundreds of others, lunatic fringers, neurotics, escapists, and suicides. Space was closed to teleportation. Jaunting was restricted to the surfaces of the planets of the solar system. But within 3 generations, the entire solar system was on the jaunt. The transition was more spectacular than the changeover from horse and buggy to gasoline age 4 centuries before. On 3 planets and 8 satellites, social, legal, and economic structures crashed, while the new customs and laws demanded by universal jaunting mushroomed in their place. There were land riots as the jaunting poor deserted slums to squat in plains and forests, raiding the livestock and wildlife. There was a revolution in home and office building. Labyrinths and masking devices had to be introduced to prevent unlawful entry by jaunting. There were crashes and panics and strikes and famines as pre-jaunt industries failed. Plagues and pandemics raged as jaunting vagrants carried disease and vermin into defenseless countries. Malaria, elephantiasis, and the breakbone fever came north to Greenland. Rabies returned to England after an absence of 300 years. The Japanese beetle, the citrus scale, the chestnut blight, and the elm borer spread to every corner of the world, and from one forgotten pest hole in Borneo, leprosy, long imagined extinct, reappeared. Crime waves swept the planets and satellites as their underworlds took to jaunting with the night around the clock, and there were brutalities as the police fought them without quarter. There came a hideous return to the worst prudery of Victorianism as society fought the sexual and moral dangers of jaunting with protocol and taboo. A cruel and vicious war broke out between the inner planets, Venus, Terra, and Mars, and the outer satellites. A war brought on by the economic and political pressures of teleportation. Until the jaunt age dawned, the 3 inner planets, and the moon, had lived in delicate economic balance with the 7 inhabited outer satellites, Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto of Jupiter, Rhea and Titan of Saturn, and Lascelles of Neptune. The united outer satellites supplied raw materials for the inner planets' manufactories, and a market for their finished goods. Within a decade, this balance was destroyed by jaunting. The outer satellites, raw young worlds in the making, had bought 70% of the IP transportation production. Jaunting ended that. They had bought 90% of the IP communications production. Jaunting ended that too. In consequence, IP purchase of OS raw materials fell off. With trade exchange destroyed, it was inevitable that the economic war would degenerate into a shooting war. Inner planets cartels refused to ship manufacturing equipment to the outer satellites, attempting to protect themselves against competition. The OS confiscated the plants already in operation on their worlds, broke patent agreements, ignored royalty obligations, and the war was on. It was an age of freaks, monsters, and grotesques. All the world was misshapen in marvelous and malevolent ways. The classicists and romantics who hated it were unaware of the potential greatness of the 25th century. They were blind to a cold fact of evolution, that progress stems from the clashing merger of antagonistic extremes, out of the marriage of pinnacle freaks. Classicists and romantics alike were unaware that the solar system was trembling on the verge of a human explosion that would transform man and make him the master of the universe. It is against this seething background of the 25th century that the vengeful history of Gulliver Foyle begins. Chapter 1. He was 170 days dying, and not yet dead. He fought for survival with the passion of a beast in a trap. He was delirious and rotting, but occasionally his primitive mind emerged from the burning nightmare of survival into something resembling sanity. Then he lifted his mute face to eternity and muttered, "What's the matter, me? Help, you goddamn gods, help is all." Blasphemy came easily to him. It was half his speech, all his life. He had been raised in the gutter school of the 25th century and spoke nothing but the gutter tongue. Of all the brutes in the world, he was among the least valuable alive and the most likely to survive. So he struggled and prayed in blasphemy, But occasionally his raveling mind leaped backwards 30 years to his childhood and remembered a nursery jingle. Gully Foyle is my name, and Terra is my nation. Deep space is my dwelling place, and death's my destination. He was Gulliver Foyle, mechanics mate 3rd class, 30 years old, big-boned and rough, and 170 days adrift in space. He was Gully Foyle, the oiler, wiper, bunker man, too easy for trouble, too slow for fun, too empty for friendship, too lazy for love. The lethargic outlines of his character showed in the official Merchant Marine records. Foyle, Gulliver, AS 128/127:066. Education, none. Skills, none. Merits, none. Recommendations, none. Personnel comments. A man of physical strength and intellectual potential stunted by a lack of ambition. Energizes at minimum. The stereotype common man. Some unexpected shock might possibly awaken him, but Psych cannot find the key. Not recommended for promotion. Has reached a dead end. He had reached a dead end. He had been content to drift from moment to moment of existence for 30 years like some heavily armored creature, sluggish and indifferent. Gully Foyle, the stereotype common man. But now he was adrift in space for 170 days, and the key to his awakening was in the lock. Presently it would turn, and open the door to Holocaust. The spaceship Nomad drifted halfway between Mars and Jupiter. Whatever war catastrophe had wrecked it had taken a sleek steel rocket, 100 yards long and 100 feet broad, and mangled it into a skeleton on which was mounted the remains of cabins, holds, decks, and bulkheads. Great rents in the hull were blazes of light on the sun side and frosty blotches of stars on the dark side. The SS Nomad was a weightless emptiness of blinding sun and jet shadow, frozen and silent. The wreck was filled with the floating conglomerate of frozen debris that hung within the destroyed vessel like an instantaneous photograph of an explosion. The minute gravitational attraction of the bits of rubble for each other was slowly drawing them into clusters, which were periodically torn apart by the passage through them of the one survivor still alive on the wreck. Gulliver Foyle, AS 128/127:066. He lived in the only airtight room left intact in the wreck, a tool locker off the main deck corridor. The locker was 4 feet wide, 4 feet deep, and 9 feet high. It was the size of a giant's coffin. 600 years before, it had been judged the most exquisite oriental torture to imprison a man in a cage that size for a few weeks. Yet Foyle had existed in this lightless coffin for 5 months, 20 days, and 4 hours. Who are you? Gully Foyle is my name. Where are you from? Terra is my nation. Where are you now? Deep space is my dwelling place. Where are you bound? Death's my destination. On the 121st day of his fight for survival, Foyle answered these questions and awoke. His heart hammered and his throat burned. He groped in the dark for the air tank which shared his coffin with him and checked it. The tank was empty. Another would have to be moved in at once. So this day would commence with an extra skirmish with death, which Foyle accepted with mute endurance. He felt through the locker shelves and located a torn spacesuit. It was the only one aboard Nomad, and Foyle no longer remembered where or how he had found it. He had sealed the tear with emergency spray, but had no way of refilling or replacing the empty oxygen cartridges on the back. Foyle got into the suit. It would hold enough air from the locker to allow him 5 minutes in vacuum, no more. Foyle opened the locker door and plunged out into the black frost of space. The air in the locker puffed out with him, and its moisture congealed into a tiny snow cloud that drifted down the torn main deck corridor. Foyle heaved at the exhausted air tank, floated it out of the locker, and abandoned it. 1 minute was gone. He turned and propelled himself through the floating debris towards the hatch to the ballast hold. He did not run. His gait was the unique locomotion of free fall and weightlessness. Thrusts with foot, elbow, and hand against deck, wall, and corner. A slow motion darting through space like a bat flying underwater. Foyle shot through the hatch into the dark side ballast hold. 2 minutes were gone. Like all spaceships, Nomad was ballasted and stiffened with the mass of her gas tanks laid down the length of her keel like a long lumber raft tapped at the sides by a labyrinth of pipe fittings. Foyle took a minute disconnecting an air tank. He had no way of knowing whether it was full or already exhausted, whether he would fight it back to his locker only to discover that it was empty and his life was ended. Once a week he endured this game of space roulette. There was a roaring in his ears. The air in his spacesuit was rapidly going foul. He yanked the massy cylinder toward the ballast hatch, ducked to let it sail over his head, then thrust himself after it. He swung the tank through the hatch. 4 minutes had elapsed and he was shaking and blacking out. He guided the tank down the main deck corridor and bolted into the tool locker. He slammed the locker door, dogged it, found a hammer on a shelf, and swung it thrice against the frozen tank to loosen the valve. Foyle twisted the handle grimly. With the last of his strength, he unsealed the helmet of his spacesuit lest he suffocate within the suit while the locker filled with air, if this tank contained air. He fainted, as he had fainted so often before, never knowing whether this was death. "Who are you?"
"Gully Foyle."
"Where are you from?"
"Terra."
"Where are you now?"
"Space."
"Where are you bound?" He awoke. He was alive. He wasted no time on prayer or thanks, but continued the business of survival. In the darkness, he explored the locker shelves where he kept his rations. There were only a few packets left. Since he was already wearing the patched spacesuit, he might just as well run the gauntlet of vacuum again and replenish his supplies. He flooded his spacesuit with air from the tank, resealed his helmet, and sailed out into frost and light again. He squirmed down the main deck corridor and ascended the remains of a stairway to the control deck, which was no more than a roofed corridor in space. Most of the walls were destroyed. With the sun on his right and the stars on his left, Foyle shot aft toward the galley storeroom. Halfway down the corridor, he passed a door frame still standing foursquare between deck and roof. The leaf still hung on its hinges, half open, a door to nowhere. Behind it was all space and the steady stars. As Foyle passed the door, he had a quick view of himself reflected in the polished chrome of the leaf. Gully Foyle, a giant black creature, bearded, crusted with dried blood and filth, emaciated, with sick, patient eyes. And followed always by a stream of floating debris, the raffle disturbed by his motion and following him through space like the tail of a festering comet. Foyle turned into the galley storeroom and began looting with the methodical speed of 5 months' habit. Most of the bottled goods were frozen solid and exploded. Much of the canned goods had lost their containers, for tin crumbles to dust in the absolute zero of space. Foyle gathered up ration packets, concentrates, and a chunk of ice from the burst water tank. He threw everything into a large copper cauldron, turned, and darted out of the storeroom, carrying the cauldron. At the door to nowhere, Foyle glanced at himself again, reflected in the chrome leaf framed in the stars. Then he stopped his motion in bewilderment. He stared at the stars behind the door, which had become familiar friends after 5 months. There was an intruder among them. A comet, it seemed, with an invisible head and a short, spurting tail. Then Foyle realized he was staring at a spaceship, stern rockets flaring as it accelerated on a sunward course that must pass him.
"No," he muttered. "No, man, no."
He was continually suffering from hallucinations. He turned to resume his journey back to the coffin. Then he looked again. It was still a spaceship, stern rockets flaring as it accelerated on a sunward course which must pass him. He discussed the illusion with eternity.
6 months already, he said in his gutter tongue. "Is it now? You listen to me, lousy gods. I tuck at a deal is all. I look again, sweet prayer men. If it's a ship, I'm yours, you own me, but if it's a gaff, man, if it's no ship, I unseal right now and blow my guts. We both ballast level us. Now reach me the sign, yes or no is all."
He looked for a third time. For the third time he saw a spaceship, stern rockets flaring as it accelerated on a sunward course which must pass him. It was the sign. He believed. He was saved. Foyle shoved off and went hurtling down control deck corridor towards the bridge. But at the companionway stairs he restrained himself. He could not remain conscious for more than a few more moments without refilling his spacesuit. He gave the approaching spaceship one pleading look, then shot down to the tool locker and pumped his suit full. He mounted to the control bridge. Through the starboard observation port he saw the spaceship, stern rockets still flaring, evidently making a major alteration in course, for it was bearing down on him very slowly. On a panel marked flares, Foyle pressed the distress button. There was a 3-second pause during which he suffered. Then white radiance blinded him as the distress signal went off in 3 triple bursts, 9 prayers for help. Foyle pressed the button twice again, and twice more the flares flashed in space while the radioactives incorporated in their combustion set up a static howl that must register on any waveband of any receiver. The stranger's jets cut off. He had been seen. He would be saved. He was reborn. He exulted. Foyle darted back to his locker and replenished his spacesuit again. He began to weep. He started to gather his possessions: a faceless clock which he kept wound just to listen to the ticking, a lug wrench with a hand-shaped handle which he would hold in lonely moments, an egg slicer upon whose wires he would pluck primitive tunes. He dropped them in his excitement, hunted for them in the dark, then began to laugh at himself. He filled his spacesuit with air once more and capered back to the bridge. He punched a flare button labeled Rescue. From the hull of the Nomad shot a sunlet that burst and hung, flooding miles of space with harsh white light. "Come on, baby you," Foyle crooned. "Hurry up, man. Come on, baby you." Like a ghost torpedo, the stranger slid into the outermost rim of light, approaching slowly, looking him over. For a moment, Foyle's heart constricted. The ship was behaving so cautiously that he feared she was an enemy vessel from the outer satellites. Then he saw the famous red and blue emblem on her side, the trademark of the mighty industrial clan of Prestane of Terra, powerful, munificent, beneficent. And he knew that this was a sister ship, for the Nomad was also Prestane-owned. He knew that this was an angel from space hovering over him. "Sweet sister," Foyle crooned. "Baby angel, fly away home with me." The ship came abreast of Foyle, illuminated ports along its side glowing with friendly light, its name and registry number clearly visible in illuminated figures on the hull. Vorga-T:1339. The ship was alongside him in a moment, passing him in a second, disappearing in a third. The sister had spurned him. The angel had abandoned him. Foyle stopped dancing and crooning. He stared in dismay. He leapt to the flare panel and slapped buttons. Distress signals, landing, takeoff, and quarantine flares burst from the hull of the Nomad in a madness of white, red, and green light, pulsing, pleading. And Vorga T-1339 passed silently and implacably, stern jets flaring again as it accelerated on a sunward course. So, in 5 seconds he was born, he lived, and he died. After 30 years of existence and 6 months of torture, Gully Foyle, the stereotyped common man, was no more. The key turned in the lock of his soul, and the door was opened. What emerged expunged the common man forever. "You pass me by," he said with slow-mounting fury. "You leave me rot like a dog. You leave me die, Vorga. Vorga T-1339. No, I get out of here, me. I follow you, Vorga. I find you, Vorga. I pay you back, me. I rot you. I kill you, Vorga. I kill you filthy." The acid of fury ran through him, eating away the brute patience and sluggishness that had made a cipher of Gully Foyle, precipitating a chain of reactions that would make an infernal machine of Gully Foyle. He was dedicated. "Vorga, I kill you filthy." He did what the cipher could not do. He rescued himself. For 2 days he combed the wreckage in 5-minute forays and devised a harness for his shoulders. He attached an air tank to the harness and connected the tank to his spacesuit helmet with an improvised hose. He wriggled through space like an ant dragging a log, but he had the freedom of the Nomad for all time. He thought. In the control bridge he taught himself to use the few navigation instruments that were still unbroken, studying the standard manuals that littered the wrecked navigation room. In the 10 years of his service in space, he had never dreamed of attempting such a thing, despite the rewards of promotion and pay. But now he had Vorga T-1339 to reward him. He took sights. The Nomad was drifting in space on the ecliptic, 300 million miles from the sun. Before him were spread the constellations Perseus, Andromeda, and Pisces. Hanging almost in the foreground was a dusty orange spot that was Jupiter, distinctly a planetary disk to the naked eye. With any luck, he could make a course for Jupiter and rescue. Jupiter was not, could never be, habitable. Like all the outer planets beyond the asteroid orbits, it was a frozen mass of methane and ammonia. But its 4 largest satellites swarmed with cities and populations, now at war with the inner planets. He would be a war prisoner, but he had to stay alive to settle accounts with Vorga T-1339. Foyle inspected the engine room of the Nomad. There was high-thrust fuel remaining in the tanks, and one of the 4 tail jets was still in operative condition. Foyle found the engine room manuals and studied them. He repaired the connection between fuel tanks and the one jet chamber. The tanks were on the sun side of the wreck and warmed above freezing point. The high thrust was still liquid, but it would not flow. In freefall, there was no gravity to draw the fuel down the pipes. Foyle studied a space manual and learned something about theoretical gravity. If he could put the Nomad into a spin, centrifugal force would impart enough gravitation to the ship to draw fuel down into the combustive chamber of the jet. If he could fire the combustion chamber, the unequal thrust of the one jet would impart a spin to the Nomad. But he couldn't fire the jet without first having the spin, and he couldn't get the spin without first firing the jet. He thought his way out of the deadlock. He was inspired by Vorga. Foyle opened the drainage petcock in the combustion chamber of the jet and tortuously filled the chamber with fuel by hand. He had primed the pump. Now, if he ignited the fuel, it would fire long enough to impart the spin and start gravity. Then the flow from the tanks would commence and the rocketing would continue. He tried matches. Matches will not burn in the vacuum of space. He tried flint and steel. Sparks will not glow in the absolute zero of space. He thought of red-hot filaments. He had no electric power of any description aboard the Nomad to make a filament red-hot. He found texts and read. Although he was blacking out frequently and close to complete collapse, he thought and planned. He was inspired to greatness by Vorga. Foyle brought ice from the frozen galley tanks, melted it with his own body heat, and added water to the jet combustion chamber. The fuel and the water were non-miscible. They did not mix. The water floated in a thin layer over the fuel. From the chemical stores, Foyle brought a silvery bit of wire, pure sodium metal. He poked the wire through the open petcock. The sodium ignited when it touched the water and flared with high heat. The heat touched off the high thrust, which burst in a needle flame from the petcock. Foyle closed the petcock with a wrench. The ignition held in the chamber, and the lone aft jet slammed out flame with a soundless vibration that shook the ship. The off-center thrust of the jet twisted the Nomad into a slow spin. The torque imparted a slight gravity. Weight returned. The floating debris that cluttered the hull fell to decks, walls, and ceilings, and the gravity kept the fuel feeding from tanks to combustion chamber. Foyle wasted no time on cheers. He left the engine room and struggled forward in desperate haste for a final fatal observation from the control bridge. This would tell him whether the Nomad was committed to a wild plunge out into the no return of deep space, or a course for Jupiter on rescue. The slight gravity made his air tank almost impossible to drag. The sudden forward surge of acceleration shook loose masses of debris which flew backward through the Nomad. As Foyle struggled up the companionway stairs to the control deck, the rubble from the bridge came hurtling back down the corridor and smashed into him. He was caught up in this tumbleweed in space, rolled back the length of the empty corridor, and brought up against the galley bulkhead with an impact that shattered his last hold on consciousness. He lay pinned in the center of a half-ton of wreckage, helpless, barely alive, but still raging for vengeance. Who are you? Where are you from? Where are you now? Where are you bound? And that's the end of Chapter 1. What a chapter, honestly. I think that's probably got to be one of the best beginnings in all of science fiction. If that doesn't have you hooked, well, I don't know what else will. Thank you for listening, if you've listened this far, and I will be back with another chapter here as soon as I can. Have a good night.